Margaret Wilson carefully applied her modest lipstick, the same shade of soft coral she'd worn for 40 years. At 78, her morning routine was a ritual that grounded her in an ever-changing world. Her small apartment in South Boston wasn't fancy, but it was clean and filled with memories, photographs of her late husband Robert, her son Michael, and various milestones that had marked her journey through life. The crisp October air nipped at her fingers as she locked her apartment door. Margaret pulled her well-worn beige coat tighter around her small frame. She had an appointment with her doctor at Boston Medical Center, a routine checkup that she never missed, despite the increasing difficulty of using public transportation with her arthritic knees. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," called Mr. Abernathy, her neighbor of 15 years, as he collected his newspaper. "Morning, Thomas," she replied with a warm smile. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Sure is. You headed downtown?" "Yes, doctor's appointment. The usual quarterly visit." Thomas nodded knowingly. They were of similar age, both navigating the challenges that came with growing older in a city that moved too fast. "Be careful out there. Those buses get crowded this time of day." Margaret nodded appreciatively. These small exchanges were important to her, reminders that she was still part of a community, even as many of her old friends had either passed on or moved to be closer to their children. The bus ride was indeed crowded, but a young woman eventually noticed Margaret standing and offered her seat. These small kindnesses kept her faith in humanity alive. As the bus wound through the streets of Boston, Margaret gazed out at the city she'd called home for nearly 5 decades. It had changed so much, with glass skyscrapers now dominating the skyline where brick buildings once stood. Her appointment went smoothly, blood pressure a bit high, but nothing alarming. The doctor recommended more walks and less salt. Margaret smiled and nodded, though they both knew her walking days were becoming more limited. After scheduling her next appointment, she checked her watch. It was only 11:30 a.m. Her son Michael had asked her to meet him for lunch at 1 p.m. at Rossetti's, an upscale Italian restaurant downtown that had recently opened to rave reviews. Michael had insisted on treating her. "Mom, I just closed a major deal. Let me spoil you a little," he'd said on the phone yesterday. Margaret had protested. Michael was always so generous with her, and she worried about being a burden. But he wouldn't take no for an answer. With time to kill, Margaret decided to visit the public garden nearby. The autumn foliage was at its peak, creating a canopy of amber and crimson overhead. She found an empty bench and sat down, watching families with young children feed the ducks. A bittersweet smile crossed her face as she remembered bringing Michael here when he was just a boy, his laughter echoing across the pond as the ducks quacked and scrambled for breadcrumbs. Margaret checked her watch again, 12:40 p.m. She should start making her way to the restaurant. Michael was always punctual, a trait he'd inherited from his father. She stood carefully, steadying herself with her worn but reliable cane, and began walking toward the restaurant district, unaware of the uncomfortable encounter that awaited her. Rossetti's gleamed with polished glass and sleek metal, its exterior a stark contrast to the historic buildings surrounding it. A valet stand attended by young men in crisp uniforms stood at the entrance, where luxury cars were whisked away by eager attendants. Margaret paused at the entrance, suddenly feeling out of place in her modest coat and sensible shoes. She pushed through the heavy glass door and was immediately enveloped in the warm, fragrant air of the restaurant. The host stand was manned by a woman in her 20s with immaculate makeup and a black designer dress. Her eyes quickly scanned Margaret, from her slightly scuffed shoes to her outdated hairstyle. "May I help you?" the hostess asked, her tone polite but cool. "Yes, I'm meeting my son for lunch. The reservation would be under Michael Wilson for 1 p.m. Margaret smiled, trying to ignore the slight tremor in her voice. The hostess tapped at her tablet, her long red nails clicking against the screen. Her perfectly shaped eyebrows furrowed slightly. "I don't see a Wilson reservation." "Could you check again, dear?" He specifically mentioned 1:30 p.m. at Rossetti's. With a barely concealed sigh, the hostess checked again. "No, there's nothing here." "Are you sure it's for today?" "Yes, quite sure. He's never late." "Perhaps he's already here." "Michael Wilson. He's tall, wears nice suits, has salt and pepper hair." The hostess glanced past Margaret at a group of well-dressed business people entering the restaurant. "Oh, we're quite busy today. Perhaps you'd like to wait outside until your son arrives. We need to keep the entrance clear for guests with reservations." Margaret felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. I suppose I could wait at the bar." The hostess's gaze flicked to the bar area, which was filled with young professionals in expensive attire. "The bar is reserved for dining customers only." A man in a tailored suit approached the host's stand. He appeared to be the manager, his expression shifting from a customer-ready smile to slight concern as he assessed the situation. "Is there a problem, Vanessa?" he asked. "This woman claims to have a reservation, but there's nothing in the system," the hostess explained, not bothering to lower her voice. The manager turned to Margaret, his expression professionally neutral but lacking warmth. "Ma'am, I'm afraid if you don't have a reservation, we can't accommodate you today. We're fully booked." "I understand that," Margaret said, her voice small but dignified. "I'm just waiting for my son. He made the reservation. As my colleague explained, we don't have a reservation under Wilson, and our policy doesn't allow non-diners to wait inside. Perhaps there was a miscommunication about the restaurant or date?" Margaret clutched her purse tighter. "I'm certain it was for today, at Rossetti's. Michael would never mix up something like this." The manager exchanged a look with the hostess. It was a look Margaret recognized, the kind adults give each other when dealing with someone they believe is confused or difficult. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to wait outside. There's a bench across the street where you can watch for your son." "But it's getting chilly out there," Margaret protested, her voice wavering slightly. "I'm sorry, but those are our policies." The manager's tone made it clear the conversation was over. He gestured toward the door. As Margaret turned to leave, she caught snippets of whispered comments from nearby staff. "Probably confused. Wrong restaurant. These old people." Her eyes stung with humiliation as she pushed back through the heavy door, the chill October air now feeling harsh against her face. She stood on the sidewalk, uncertain what to do. Michael was never late, and he was always meticulous about details. Had she gotten something wrong? Was her memory failing her? She checked her phone. No messages from Michael. It was now 1:05 p.m. Margaret decided to call him, her fingers trembling slightly as she navigated her phone's contact list. As she pressed the call button, a sleek black Porsche pulled up to the valet stand. The valet attendants snapped to attention as the gleaming Porsche 911 purred to a stop. The door opened, and Michael Wilson emerged, 6'2", impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that whispered rather than shouted its five-figure price tag. At 52, Michael carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had built something from nothing. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and his eyes, the same warm brown as Margaret's, quickly scanned the restaurant entrance. When he spotted his mother standing on the sidewalk, confusion crossed his face, followed by concern. He handed his keys to the valet and strode quickly toward her. "Mom, what are you doing out here?" "It's getting cold." Michael immediately removed his cashmere overcoat and draped it around Margaret's shoulders despite her protests. "I was just trying to call you," Margaret explained, attempting to keep her voice steady. "There seems to be some confusion about our reservation." Michael checked his watch, an understated Patek Philippe that had been a gift to himself when his company went public. "I'm only 5 minutes late. Traffic on the expressway was brutal." Did they say there was a problem with the reservation? Margaret hesitated, not wanting to make a fuss. They said they couldn't find it in their system. Michael's expression shifted subtly. Those who knew him in business would have recognized the look. It was the one he wore when he identified a problem that needed to be resolved immediately. "Let's go inside and straighten this out," he said, offering his arm to his mother, who took it gratefully. As they entered Rossetti's together, the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. The hostess, who had dismissed Margaret minutes earlier, looked up, her practiced smile faltering slightly when she recognized the older woman. Her eyes widened as she took in Michael's obvious wealth and authority. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome to Rossetti's," she said, pointedly addressing only Michael. "Michael Wilson. I believe I had a 1 p.m. reservation for 2. His tone was even, but carried the weight of someone used to being heard. The hostess quickly consulted her tablet. "Oh, here it is. It was under Wilson, M. I must have missed it earlier when you're—" She glanced at Margaret. When the lady asked, Michael's eyebrow raised slightly. "That lady is my mother, Margaret Wilson." The hostess flushed. "Of course. My apologies for the confusion." The manager, noticing the exchange, approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Wilson, welcome to Rossetti's. We have your table ready. Please, follow me." As they were led through the restaurant, Margaret could feel the stares of other diners. She clutched Michael's arm tighter, feeling simultaneously proud of her son and ashamed of her earlier treatment. The manager seated them at a prime table near the window, with a view of the Boston skyline. "Your server will be with you momentarily. Can I start you with something from the bar?" "Mom," Michael looked at Margaret. "Just water for me, thank you," she said softly. "I'll have the same," Michael decided. As the manager walked away, he turned to his mother. Mom, what really happened when you got here?" Margaret adjusted the napkin in her lap, avoiding Michael's gaze. "It was nothing, dear. Just a misunderstanding about the reservation." Michael reached across the table and gently took his mother's hand. "Mom, I've negotiated with some of the toughest business people in the country. I can tell when someone isn't telling me the whole story." Margaret sighed. They asked me to wait outside. Said I couldn't stay in the entrance or at the bar since I wasn't a dining customer." Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Even though you told them you were meeting me for a reservation, they didn't believe me," she admitted, her voice small. "I think they thought I was confused, or maybe that I was, making it up to have somewhere warm to sit." Something flashed in Michael's eyes, a rare glimpse of the steel beneath his polished exterior. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by warmth as he squeezed his mother's hand. "Well, they were wrong, and I'm sorry you had to experience that." Their server approached, a young man in his 20s with a carefully cultivated air of sophistication. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wilson, Mrs. Wilson. Today we have several specials." He launched into a detailed description of dishes featuring ingredients Margaret barely recognized. When he finished, Michael turned to his mother. "What sounds good to you, Mom? Order anything you like." Margaret studied the menu, her eyes widening slightly at the prices. "Perhaps just the Caesar salad?" Michael smiled gently. "Mom, we're celebrating today. How about the grilled salmon? You love salmon?" Margaret nodded, grateful for the suggestion. After they ordered, Michael casually steered the conversation toward safer topics: her doctor's appointment, news from her bridge club, updates on her grandchildren. But Margaret could tell part of his mind was elsewhere, working through something. As their appetizers arrived, Michael's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and then back at his mother. "Excuse me for just a moment. I need to make a quick call." Margaret nodded, watching as her son stepped away from the table. phone pressed to his ear, his expression unreadable. While Margaret sampled the artfully plated appetizer, tiny morsels of lobster atop delicate crackers that cost more than she would typically spend on a week's worth of groceries. Michael stood near the restaurant's entrance, his phone to his ear. His manner was calm, but the intensity in his eyes would have been familiar to anyone who had ever sat across from him at a negotiating table. "Yes, Lawrence," Michael spoke into the phone. "I need you to pull some information for me on Rossetti's restaurant in downtown Boston. Specifically, I want to know who's on the ownership group." He listened for a moment. "Yes, that's unusually urgent. I'll hold." As he waited, Michael observed the restaurant operations with a practiced eye. The hostess, who had turned his mother away, was now fawning over another well-dressed couple. The manager was making rounds, stopping at select tables, those with the most expensive bottles of wine or most recognizable patrons. "Got it. Thank you, Lawrence," Michael said after a few minutes. "And the managing partners are? Interesting. Yes, send me everything you have." "Thanks." When Michael returned to the table, his expression had softened back into the son Margaret knew, though she could still sense an undercurrent of something steely beneath the surface. "Everything okay?" Always concerned about his work stress. "Perfect," Michael assured her with a smile. "Just some business that couldn't wait. Now, tell me more about how Mrs. Abernathy's daughter is doing at college." Throughout the meal, Margaret couldn't help but notice the change in service. Their waiter was attentive to the point of hovering. The manager stopped by twice to ensure everything was to their satisfaction. By the third time the manager appeared, just as they were considering dessert, Margaret could sense Michael's patience wearing thin. "Mr. Wilson, Mrs. Wilson, I trust everything has been satisfactory," the manager inquired, his smile now seemingly genuine. "The food has been excellent," Michael replied evenly, "though I must say, the welcome could have been warmer." The manager's smile faltered. "Sir, my mother arrived on time for our reservation and was made to wait outside in the cold because your staff didn't believe she belonged here." Michael's tone remained conversational, but there was no mistaking the challenge in it. The manager's face flushed. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." "Was there?" Michael interrupted. "Or was there an assumption made based on how my mother was dressed? Or perhaps her age?" "Michael," Margaret said softly, placing her hand on his. "It's all right. Let's just enjoy our lunch." Michael covered her hand with his own, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "It's not all right, Mom. You deserve better." He turned back to the manager. "Tell me, do all your guests get asked to wait across the street, or just the ones who don't arrive in luxury cars?" The manager's discomfort was palpable. "Mr. Wilson, I assure you this isn't how we typically operate. If there was a misunderstanding, I sincerely apologize." "An apology is a start," Michael acknowledged. "But it should be directed to my mother, not to me." The manager turned to Margaret, his professional mask slipping to reveal genuine remorse. "Mrs. Wilson, please accept my deepest apologies for the way you were treated. It was inexcusable." Margaret, ever gracious, nodded. "Thank you. I accept your apology." After the manager left, Michael sighed. "You're too forgiving, Mom." "And you've always been too protective," she countered with a small smile. "Ever since you were a little boy. Do you remember when Tommy Fitzgerald pushed me in the grocery store? You were only 9, but you stood up to a grown man." Michael laughed softly at the memory. "He didn't push you on purpose, Mom. It was crowded, and he bumped into you. But yes, I remember telling him he needed to apologize to my mom, the best lady in Boston." "You've always seen the best in me," Margaret said, her eyes growing misty, "even when others don't see me at all." Michael reached for her hand again. "Mom, do you know why I wanted to have lunch today?" Besides celebrating the deal? Margaret shook her head. 25 years ago today, you took a second mortgage on your house to lend me $50,000 to start my business. You believed in me when no one else would. Margaret waved her hand dismissively. Any mother would have done the same. No, Michael said firmly. Most wouldn't have. You worked 2 jobs for years after Dad died. That house was everything you had, and you risked it on me, a kid with a business plan that every bank in Boston had rejected. Well, Margaret said with a small smile, seems like it worked out okay. Michael looked around the expensive restaurant, at his Patek Philippe watch, thought of the Porsche outside, and laughed. Yeah, you could say that. But Mom, everything I have, everything I've built, it started with you believing in me. As they finished their dessert, Michael's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, and a slight smile played at the corner of his mouth. Excuse me, Mom, one more quick call. Margaret watched as her son stepped away again, wondering what business matter required such urgency during their lunch. But she didn't mind. Seeing Michael in his element, confident, respected, successful, filled her with quiet pride. She remembered the boy who had struggled in school, who had been told his ideas were unrealistic, who had faced rejection after rejection. Now he moved through the world with such ease. It hadn't been an easy road, but she had never doubted him for a moment. When Michael returned to the table, there was a glint in his eye that Margaret recognized from his childhood. The look he got when he was particularly pleased with himself. Ready to go, Mom? I have one more surprise for you today. As they stepped out of Rossetti's, the valet immediately rushed to retrieve Michael's Porsche. The same hostess who had dismissed Margaret earlier held the door, her smile now almost painfully wide. Thank you for dining with us today, Mrs. Wilson, Mr. Wilson. We hope to see you again soon. Michael helped his mother into the passenger seat of his Porsche, making sure she was comfortable before closing the door. As he settled into the driver's seat, he turned to her. How would you feel about taking a little drive before I take you home? There's something I'd like to show you. Margaret nodded, always happy to spend more time with her son. As they pulled away from the restaurant, she noticed Michael was smiling to himself. You're looking awfully pleased about something, she observed. Did your business call go well? You could say that, Michael replied cryptically. But I'm taking you to see a property I just acquired. They drove through Boston's winding streets, eventually leaving the downtown area and heading toward Dorchester, the working-class neighborhood where Margaret had raised Michael as a single mother after his father died. The familiar streets brought back a flood of memories for both of them. The small park where Michael had played baseball, the corner store where he'd worked his first job, the public library where Margaret had taken him every Saturday morning. Michael pulled up in front of a small, somewhat dilapidated building that Margaret recognized immediately. Her hand flew to her mouth in surprise. Michael, is that Rosie's Diner? He confirmed with a nod. Or at least, it used to be. The once beloved neighborhood diner had clearly seen better days. The windows were papered over, and a "For Sale" sign hung crookedly in the window, with a "Sold" sticker plastered across it. I don't understand, Margaret said, looking from the building to her son. Michael turned off the engine and turned to face her. Do you remember how much time we spent here when I was growing up? Margaret nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Of course, Rosie used to let us split a meal when money was tight. She kept a tab for us during the months after your father died, when I could barely make rent. And do you remember what you told me the day I got rejected for that small business loan for the 6th time? We were sitting in our usual booth, and I was ready to give up. Margaret smiled at the memory. I told you that it doesn't matter where you start, it matters where you finish. And that sometimes the people who have the least give the most. Exactly, Michael said, his own voice thick with emotion. "Mom, I bought this building, and I'm going to reopen it as a diner. An affordable place where people in the neighborhood can get a good meal without judgment, where a single mom can bring her kid without worrying about being turned away." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "Oh, Michael, I'm going to call it Margaret's," he continued. "Yui, and we're going to have a policy that no one, no matter how they're dressed or how much money they appear to have, gets treated like you were treated today." Margaret was openly crying now, overwhelmed by her son's gesture. "I don't know what to say." Michael took her hand. "There's more. Remember how Rosie helped us when we needed it most? I've set up a program where families in need can eat for free. No questions asked. The paying customers will essentially subsidize it, though they won't know that's what they're doing." "Won't that be expensive to maintain?" Margaret asked, always practical, despite her emotion. Michael smiled. "Mom, do you know what the deal was that I closed yesterday? My company is being acquired by Jensen International. The deal closed at $1.2 billion. Margaret's jaw dropped. "Billion? With a BD? With a B?" Michael confirmed. "I own 42% of the company. So yes, I can afford to run a diner that feeds people who need it." He paused, then added, "I made some calls during lunch. I also happen to now own a 15% stake in the restaurant group that owns Rossetti's." "Michael!" Margaret gasped. "You didn't." "I did," he said unapologetically. "Not for revenge, but for influence. I've already spoken with the majority owners. There's going to be a company-wide review of their hospitality practices, starting tomorrow. And that manager and hostess, they're being transferred to the company's training division to help develop a new customer service program focused on treating everyone with dignity, regardless of appearance." Margaret shook her head in amazement. "You were always one for grand gestures." "I learned from the best," Michael replied. "From a woman who took extra shifts cleaning office buildings so her son could have a computer. From a woman who skipped meals but never let her son go hungry. From a woman who taught me that true worth isn't measured by the clothes you wear or the car you drive." Margaret reached out and touched her son's face gently. "I'm so proud of the man you've become, Michael. Not because of your success or your money, but because of your heart." Michael covered her hand with his own. "Everything good in me came from you, Mom. Everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both looking at the old diner, seeing not what it was, but what it would become. "So," Michael finally said, "want to see the inside? The contractors start tomorrow, and I'd love your input on how to recreate that booth where we always sat." Margaret smiled through her tears, nodding. As they got out of the Porsche, which looked almost comically out of place on the modest street, a few neighborhood kids stopped their basketball game to stare at the luxury car. Michael noticed their interest and gave them a friendly wave. "Is that your car, mister?" One bold boy called out. "It is," Michael answered. "Oh, but you know what? It's just a car. The real treasure is this lady right here, my mom." The boy looked skeptically at Margaret in her modest coat and sensible shoes, clearly not understanding. But someday, Michael thought, maybe he would. 6 months later, on a bright spring morning, a small crowd gathered outside the newly renovated diner. The faded facade had been restored to its former glory, with a fresh coat of paint in warm, welcoming colors. A new sign hung proudly over the entrance, "Margaret's Place," with the tagline, "Where everyone belongs," in smaller letters beneath. The grand opening had drawn quite a mix of people. Longtime neighborhood residents curious about the changes to their local landmark, reporters from local media outlets attracted by the feel-good story of a successful businessman giving back to his community, and several sharply dressed executives who seemed slightly out of place among the working-class crowd. Michael stood at the entrance, dressed more casually than usual in slacks and a button-down shirt. No tie. But it was Margaret who held the ceremonial scissors for the ribbon cutting, looking both proud and slightly embarrassed by all the attention. She wore a new dress for the occasion, still modest, still very much her style, but of notably better quality than her usual attire. "Speech!" someone called from the crowd, and others took up the chant. Michael stepped forward, his arm around his mother's shoulders. "Thank you all for coming today. This is a very special moment for my family, especially for my mother, Margaret Wilson." He looked down at her with unmistakable affection. Some of you who grew up in this neighborhood might remember this place as Rosie's Diner, where a kind woman named Rosie Martinez fed the community for nearly 30 years. When I was a boy, my mother brought me here at least once a week. Sometimes it was to celebrate good news, an A on a test, a victory in a baseball game. More often, it was simply because Mom was too tired to cook after working 2 jobs. He paused, his expression growing more serious. What none of you knew, what I didn't even know at the time, was that there were days when my mother couldn't afford to eat herself, but she made sure I never went hungry. Rosie understood that, and there were many times she accidentally made too much food and insisted we take it home. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. Margaret squeezed her son's hand, her eyes moist. "When I had the opportunity to buy this building, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it," Michael continued. "Margaret's place isn't just a tribute to my mother, though she deserves that and more. It's a commitment to the values she taught me. That everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, that we all need help sometimes, and that how you treat people who can do nothing for you reveals everything about your character." He gestured to the diner behind him. "Inside these doors, everyone is welcome. We have a special program called Meals with Dignity, where families facing financial hardship can eat for free. No questions asked. And for our paying customers, a portion of every meal goes toward supporting that program." There was a smattering of applause, which quickly grew louder. "One more thing," Michael added when the applause died down. "I want to introduce you to our new manager, who will be overseeing day-to-day operations." A familiar face stepped forward. The manager from Rossetti's, who had asked Margaret to wait outside 6 months earlier. But now, instead of condescension, his expression showed genuine respect as he shook Margaret's hand. "David has spent the last 6 months working directly with community outreach programs across Boston," Michael explained. "He's learned a lot about seeing beyond first impressions, and he's eager to put those lessons into practice here." David stepped up to the microphone. "Mrs. Wilson, I want to thank you publicly for the lesson you taught me. 6 months ago, I made a terrible judgment based solely on appearances, and in doing so, I not only hurt you, but missed the opportunity to learn from your wisdom and experience. I'm grateful for this second chance to get it right." Margaret nodded graciously, accepting his words without comment. As the ribbon was cut and the doors opened for the first time, the crowd surged forward. Inside, they found a thoughtfully designed space that honored the diner's history while providing modern comforts. Old photographs lined the walls, many featuring Rosie Martinez and her family, alongside newer images showing Margaret and Michael through the years. In a place of honor near the entrance was a framed article from the Boston Globe, dated just 1 week after the incident at Rossetti's. The headline read, "Local tech entrepreneur acquires minority stake in luxury restaurant group, implements diversity training." Throughout the morning, Margaret moved from table to table, greeting guests with the same warmth she'd always shown neighbors, regardless of their station in life. At one point, She found herself speaking with a young woman in a server's uniform who looked vaguely familiar. "You probably don't remember me," the young woman said hesitantly, "but I was the hostess at Rossetti's that day. The day I asked you to wait outside." Margaret's expression remained kind. "I remember. I was terrible to you," the young woman admitted, looking ashamed. "I judged you based on your appearance, and I'm so sorry for that." "We all make mistakes, dear," Margaret replied. "The important thing is what we learn from them." "Your son could have had me fired," the woman said. "Instead, he insisted I be part of the team developing the new customer service training. He said I had first-hand experience with how not to treat people." She gave a small laugh. "At first I was resentful, but over time I came to understand what he was trying to teach me." "And what was that?" Margaret asked. "That dignity isn't something you earn with money or status. It's something everyone deserves, simply for being human." The woman paused, then added, "I'll be helping train the staff here 1 day a week, alongside my new role as community liaison for the restaurant group." Margaret reached out and patted the young woman's hand. "Then, something good came from our uncomfortable encounter. That's how growth happens sometimes, through discomfort." Later, as the crowd thinned and the excitement of the opening began to settle, Michael found his mother sitting in a specific booth, the exact recreation of the one where they had spent so many hours during his childhood. He slid in across from her, just as he had done hundreds of times before. "So?" he asked. "So what do you think?" Margaret looked around the diner, taking in the happy faces of the staff and customers, the warm atmosphere, the sense of community that was already forming. "I think Rosie would be proud. I know I am." Michael reached across the table and took his mother's hand, just as she had done for him so many times when he needed reassurance. "You know, Mom, all those years ago when you took out that second mortgage to help me start my business, this, right here, right now, is what I was really working toward. Not the Porsche or the penthouse apartment. This." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "The chance to create a place where people like us, like we were back then, would never be made to feel less than. The chance to repay, in some small way, the kindness that was shown to us when we needed it most." He squeezed her hand. "The chance to make you proud." "Oh, Michael," Margaret said softly, "I've always been proud of you, from the very beginning." As they sat together in the booth, sharing a piece of apple pie just like they used to, Michael watched his mother, her face lined with the years of sacrifice and hard work that had made his success possible. To him, she had always been the wealthiest person he knew, rich in the things that truly mattered: dignity, compassion, and unwavering love. Outside, the hustle of Boston continued, people rushing past, often too busy to really see one another. But inside Margaret's place, a small revolution was taking place, a revolution of kindness, of seeing beyond appearances, of recognizing the inherent worth in every person who walked through the door. And it had all started with a simple elderly woman being turned away from a restaurant, and her son's Porsche pulling up minutes later.